بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. I am happy and proud and grateful and honored that Professor Khaled Abou El Fadl will be talking to us today. I cannot go through the qualifications of Dr. Khaled Abou El Fadl because this will take the time of the lecture. I can say that what I am proud of is that Khaled was with this center and with our youth group and with that culture, and now he became one of our champions in the area of academia and in the area of enlightened, progressive Islamic thought, very respected voice in so many international circles, and he really earned it the hard way, being a very solid researcher and a very proliferative writer and a very comprehensive thinker, not only in breadth but also in depth. And with that sense of pride and gratitude, I introduce to you Professor Khaled Abou El Fadl.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Dr. Rahaf. It's been this hall, this center, these walls, the audience that comes and goes through years. It's been 30 years. It's sometimes difficult to imagine that 30 years have gone by since I first saw this building. But alhamdulillah for that. That's an enormous blessing that in any life, for anything to be so stable and so constant and so persistent. Of course, I've one of the tricks of academics when they want to talk about too much is to choose a title to their talk that is hopelessly broad, and this way they can speak about whatever they want to speak about. And so the future of Islam is one such title. I'm not going to speak about the future of Islam because that is only in the knowledge of God, and none of us can speculate about it. But I can speak about some reflections about our future as a Muslim community in the United States, and as a Muslim community of a microcosm of a bigger organism, a Muslim community in the West, which is part of yet a bigger phenomena, and that is a Muslim community in a liberal Western democracy. And we can go on. Now note, when we say Muslim community in a Western liberal democracy, immediately, just by categorizing it as such, we acknowledge the existence of other hyphenated Muslim communities. So there are Muslim communities in socialist democracies, there are Muslim communities in Eastern struggling democracies, there are Muslim communities in non-Muslim, non-democratic, non-Western, whatever the category might be, states, there are literally Muslims in an endless variety of permutations of communities and societies. And Islam is, as an international and universal phenomena, historically and as well as theologically, and lesser known to Muslims normally, is that also jurisprudentially has survived and thrived in all types of alternative permutations of sociological and political realities. So, if we just look around this room, we find that, all of us came from a remarkably diverse set of backgrounds. If we just count the countries we came from, the cultures, the subcultures, so even someone like myself who is of Egyptian origins, yet I represent a particular, or my background represents a particular subculture within Egyptian culture, which is within a subculture within an Arab culture, which is a subculture within an Afro-Asian culture, etc., etc. And so all of us, in fact, are testament to the resilience of the Islamic message, and as I said, sociologically, theologically, and jurisprudentially. The fact that we exist, and our parents exist, and their parents exist, the fact that they existed as Muslims and existed as Muslims for generations. This is a critical point to keep in mind, because it is all too attractive and all too easy for, especially during this period in history, where a particular civilization is dominant, and this civilization sees the world from its point of view, and that's nothing that you can fault a civilization for, because every civilization has done that. The Romans saw the world from the prism of the Roman eye, and when you, for instance, go to, some of you would be surprised to know that the Gothic tribes lived in among other places in North Africa, including Libya, and when you read reality, you read history from the eyes of the Gothic tribes who lived in Libya, you see a very different worldview, but the dominant one, the one that we learn in schools, is usually the perspective of the dominant civilization. And certainly Muslims did that as well at different periods in their history, where the view that the world is seen from the eyes of Muslims in Baghdad or Muslims in Cairo, etc., etc. So the temptation is to speak of Muslims in the West as if it is a unique and unprecedented and unparalleled historical reality, as if this is the first time that Islam finds itself in an environment that somehow is challenging at many levels in which it is not in other contexts. And that is simply not true. It's not true because in the more than 50% of Muslims that exist in the world live in countries that are not Muslim by population majority. So the Islamic theology and Islamic law had developed mechanisms, or in academic discourses, language would say discourses, of talking about the other, the non-Muslim, when that other is the one who controls the police, controls the army, controls the waterworks, controls the economy, centuries ago. And in fact, there is no one dominant prevailing discourse. There are several orientations of discourses. There are several competing trends. What if we study these variety of competing orientations, we start noticing themes that emerge. So if you study a sufficient number of Muslim communities, and here a note that again is often missed, is that we study it not just from the perspective of one point of history, because quite a few historians, for instance, will look back 600 years as if that moment in history can tell them everything about the past, or they will look back 1,000 years as if that moment in history can tell them everything about the past. History can only be studied and understood as a progression. So, for instance, 1,000 years ago, if you looked at Muslim communities in Malaysia or Indonesia, you see a very, very different reality than if you look 500 years ago. There's a progression from Islam in Malaysia 1,000 years ago to Islam in Malaysia and 500 years ago to Islam in Malaysia 100 years ago. Even more so in a case such as the Philippines. Spain is rather a stark example. You know, you'll find a thriving civilization at one point and a complete disappearance of the civilization at another point. But one of the critical issues is, in several contexts, we find that Muslim communities, in several historical manifestations, historical examples, start out as a quite a small phenomena, and then become a more mainstream phenomena. They grow, they flourish in a variety of ways, and the question from the point of view of someone who's really interested in the history of Islam and Muslims is, well, what common themes do we find to be able to say, well, here's where Muslims flourish, here's where Muslims don't flourish. Okay, so far so good? It's a simple point of trying to not learn from a past 10 years or 30 years. In my case, you know, my lived experience with the Islamic Cntr, but you take your gaze and you look back and try to study variety of points. I'll tell you one way to become a bigoted ideologue, whether for or against, whether you're a bigoted ideologue for Islam or against Islam, is to look back at one point in history and from that one point generalize upon all others. And that is done all too often. And that's usually, it's definitely a reliable indication of not just poor scholarship, but a deformed psychology. The inability to know that people just don't manifest all truths herein and forever in just one moment in the past. So you need to study these elements, various elements, to be able to track a progression and to be able to say, well, I see a trajectory and I can track trajectories. And of course, this is maybe in the question and answer session I can elaborate a bit about this. But there are some common surprising themes or trajectories. One of the most surprising in a popular sense, I have to admit it was not surprising to me, but when you read much of what's written about Islam in the United States or in the West, you realize maybe this point is not so orthodox as someone who does research all the time thinks, and that is actually Islam or Muslim communities that seem to have a short-lived historical experience, so that they emerged in one point or another, and then were either destroyed or became extinct, so they fizzled out. If they fizzled out, it's usually through either migration, extinction, or eventual conversions. So the generations of generations simply forget the reality of Islam. And one of the constant themes is what we might call anthropological or sociological despotism. It's not counterintuitive, but it is something that is borne out by the historical record and must be recalled. When Muslim communities have existed in societies that are socially despotic, unopen and closed, and unwilling to engage the other because of a sense, a dogmatic sense of who is good and who is bad, and a xenophobia to the outsider. Usually social despotism is a product of political despotism, but political despotism can sometimes camouflage itself in various ways. But we find that it is consistently, Islam thrives in climates of social openness and social interaction in a socially interactive context. The second point, which is closely related to the first, is that there is a very interesting correlation between commercial activities and the thriving of Islam in particular societies. So I've started noticing that in places where there is a lively, active, commercial Muslim class, merchant class, by our language they would say business class, there tended to also be a progressively thriving Muslim community. You can draw many things from that, and a variety of ways of understanding that. Now, it is impossible to have a thriving commercial class or merchant class if you also do not have either people who handle money, they either ignore theology and law to make money, or they work with theology and law in the process of making money. And again, the theme is successful Muslim models in the past in various social, in various geographical locations. And here, the examples where you find a merchant class ignoring theology and law, basically losing interest in theology and law, Not surprisingly, the generations, subsequent generations, seem to assimilate and disappear. They become absorbed either in Buddhist heritage or Hindu heritage, or even sometime tribal, traditional religious heritages. In other words, a variety of local folkloric traditions. But in examples where the merchant class seems to be not just interested but engaged with the theologians and legalists. And what is quite fascinating is that we often talk about fiqh al-aqaliyat, or the fiqh of minorities, as if it is a new phenomenon. But in reality, some of the most remarkable and engaging and fascinating and even, I'll use the expression, mind-blowing examples of Islamic jurisprudential creativity is in the jurists who worked with these early mercantile classes in various geographical contexts. One of the rather simple examples is as merchant classes, for instance, ventured in sub-Saharan Africa, and there were constantly questions about doing business with individuals who clearly were not Ahl Kitab, and in fact represented, in outer appearance at least, shared many characteristics with the polytheists of Mecca. And the question in a range of fatwa that we have that can be found from anywhere from cities like Timbuktu to odd cities in Ethiopia and even the Congo and so on, or in Mauritania, which is rich with manuscripts and examples of manuscripts, is that when Muslim jurists were creative and engaged, when it was a clearly collaborative effort, that made things go much more smoothly than in other examples, as for instance in some periods in Muslim Spain when the Zahiri school came out with fatwa that were uncompromising and that condemned a whole set of adaptive practices and so on. The third trajectory that one notices from this type of research is, and this is perhaps one of the most significant ones, is that the distinction between an immigrant Muslim experience and a native Muslim experience. Generally, immigrant Muslim communities thrived economically, but not Islamically. They generated little in terms of Islamic discourses that can be interesting. Quite often, it just you find a lot of creativity in the first generation or second generation, and then if there is any creativity, it is always by native populations that have converted to Islam. This is something we need to pause at for a bit, because it seems, at least the historical record so far, is that if Islam remains an immigrant phenomena, something adopted by an immigrant culture and defined to accommodate that immigrant culture, it doesn't have the power to last as a system of belief. However, when it is adopted by, as for instance the example of Muslims in Bosnia, adopted by after the first or second generation by a native population that have come in contact with Muslim merchants and converted to Islam, usually through that then you've got a very different dynamic. You've got a population that not only survives and survives for centuries, but indeed produces fascinating theological work and jurisprudential work as well. It is just amazing reading the manuscripts of these populations. Even in Muslim Spain, it is one of the things that to think about is that when Andalusian Muslims of native Spanish Muslims, were at one point thought initially the assistance of the North African Muslims, whether the Murabitun and later on, anyway, the whole dynamic of Muslim survival in Spain became quite different when the reality changed initially from immigrant to native, and then it went from native to immigrant. And that contributed in a variety of ways for some very infamous treasonous acts by native Muslims who thought no sense of loyalty to al-Muwahhidun or the Murabitun, as the case might apply, who had come from North Africa, and they saw them as oppressive immigrants that had come out from the outside to dominate them and so on and so forth. And then they ended up helping Christian and Spanish authorities against their fellow Muslims. It's a very treacherous story, but it is something that is a constant theme. Immigrants seem to have time on their side in first generation and second generation because they are novel, they come out with ideas. The ideas sometimes are, well, at least in history, are quite original and engaging, but after that, the clock starts ticking, and if there is not a viable native population, the immigrant first and second generation, the set of ideas and institutions that they left start deteriorating rather quickly. Okay, so I mean, there are a variety of trajectories that they can easily fill a rather long volume, but I'll get to some of the ones that are perhaps even more relevant to us. Interestingly, and I'm not quite sure what I think about this, at least in my research I found that there is a correlation between thriving Muslim communities and open markets. That in closed economic societies, Muslims thrived, fared much worse, which is, I don't know, I mean, I'm not sure what to think about that, but the factual record cannot be denied. Further, there is a fascinating relationship between the survival of a class of Arabic bearers. None of the examples that I've studied, which for the most part involve Muslims outside of Arabic-speaking countries, but none of them Arabic becomes so popular as to become the tongue of native populations. Countries where Arabic became the tongue were already semiotically inclined towards that language. So the language spoken in Arabic at the time that Islam entered, the language spoken in Egypt at the time Islam entered Egypt or Syria or Iraq and so on, were already quite close to the Arabic language, and so the transition was not a radical one. But in cases where the transition would have been more radical, such as in Turkey or Persia, we see that Arabic engages the language. So it engaged Turkish and produced something called Ottoman Turkish, which is heavily influenced with Arabic. It engaged Persian and produced a type of Persian that's heavily influenced by the language of the Quran. But what is a powerful correlation is that there remained a class, if you will, you want to use the word elite, depends. I mean, they were not necessarily elite in the sense of privileged, but a core class, and this holds true in Africa, in Asia, even in Muslim communities that survived for a long time in South American countries, which is an understudied phenomena and a little understood phenomena, or in countries such as Trinidad and Tobago and so on, is that there remained a group that would master the Arabic language. They were not necessarily the jurists or the problem solvers, but they tended to play an officiating role in a variety of sociological circumstances. So they would often be the people who conduct marriage ceremonies, conduct funerals, etc., etc. And there's quite a bit to say about that. I mean, it's clear that there is a relationship that is maintained to the language of the Quran that is plays an institutional role, but at the same time, that language doesn't become the only way for people to express their sociological realities. One of the things that struck me in my readings about this is, I don't know if it's still around. I'm more withdrawn from American Muslim communities than I used to be. But I remember that when I was in Texas, there were a lot of Muslims who would come and say that we were told that if you're a real Muslim, you do not read the Quran in translation, and that you must only learn how to pronounce the Arabic even if you don't understand it, and so on. From a socio-historical perspective, that's disastrous. Examples of Muslim communities that thrive by not producing their own discourse and own creative engagement with Islam, native creative engagement with Islam is non-existent. I'll share with you some interesting footnotes among trajectories. One of the most remarkable things is, do you know, other than commerce, what is the other greatest common correlation that one finds? I'm sure you'll be surprised, and that's art, particularly music, and particularly music and poetry. So we find that in vast areas in Africa and vast area in various islands in Malaysia and Indonesia and the Philippines at one point, Islam, the Islamic message is sort of transformed into fascinating folkloric songs, or from our perspective today, it was folkloric songs. But what quite interesting that you find some of the grouchy fuqaha, grouchy jurists, would describe these songs as aghani mubtazila, or sort of cheap, trashy songs. But when we look at them today, they're far from trashy. They're actually summarize the whole Islamic message in a single song and so on. But it's quite remarkable that I even can go as far as saying that I haven't found a single example of no music and the survival of a native Muslim reality, which is again interesting because of the discourse that we have that pops up every once in a while that says music is haram in Islam and so on. One of the things that you can, just if you want to get a flavor for this, there's a 30 volume, well, it's not, don't get the book version, get the CD version. 30 CDs, they're either 30 books or 30 CDs, called The Music of Islam. And it gives you samples of the various musical samples that emerge from different parts of the world and different parts. And interestingly, it was not compiled, of course, by Muslims, it was compiled by non-Muslims.